The Glock enhanced trigger. Let's check it out. The Glock trigger, it's always been spongy, almost like a two-stage trigger, and it has that reset, and then it just has that mush and then a break, and the break's not that crisp. On the Gen 5, they've upped the game with their triggers. They're a little bit better, just have a little more defined break to them, but still, it's a Glock trigger. And when I describe it, I say, it's a Glock trigger. There have been a ton of aftermarket triggers that have come out for Glocks, because trigger pull is a very important part of shooting. The better that you have control over the trigger, the smoother the break, the less movement that your hand's going to make. And it's really important to have a good trigger. But I've been shooting Glock triggers for years, and really I do like the flat face trigger from Wheaton Arms. It is incredible. But as far as something that is OEM or factory, that is really very important, you know, for reliability and also liability if you ever have to use something in a self-defense situation. So we're going to take a look at the enhanced Glock trigger. These are made specifically for Gen 5 and for the 9mm versions pretty much, from the 19 all the way to the 47. Now, I actually picked up this trigger at the Palmetto State Armory gathering, and Glock had their booth and tent set up. And so when I was talking to one of the guys there, he had an extra trigger that he let me take so I could do this review. And so we really appreciate Glock for providing the trigger. Now here we have the Gen 5 Glock Model 17, and it has the enhanced trigger. And then we have just the Model 47 with the standard OEM trigger. We're going to kind of look at an overview of what to expect when you get it, and then we're going to get some closer shots that are more in detail. But first off, go ahead and make sure that the guns are unloaded. Both have no magazines in them. Now, word to the wise, when you get your trigger, it's going to have this rubber band that's going to be holding the trigger bar to the trigger housing. You don't want to take this off and then separate the trigger bar and trigger housing. It is a trick to get it back together. And so that's one thing I'm going to give you a heads up. I did take mine apart, and honestly, Robbie Wheaton from Wheaton Arms helped me to put it back together in the correct way. And it took him a few minutes to figure it out, and he's been gunsmithing for 20 years. Now, because I got this at an event and the guy just gave me the trigger, there was no packaging with it. And so we're just going to kind of look at some of the differences right up front. Definitely one of the big things about the new enhanced trigger is that it's just a very nice break to it. A little bit of take up, hits a definite wall, and that is a really crisp break for a combat type trigger. But also, it's a much lesser trigger pull, and we'll weigh that out in a minute. As far as reset, I mean, it's a Glock reset, maybe just a touch longer. Here with the original trigger, it's a little bit longer. It hits kind of a spongy wall, which is typical for Glock. We have some resistance, and then we have the break, which is a Glock trigger. It's not very crisp. It definitely reminds me of a sponge. It just always has. Now, I've gotten used to shooting this trigger, and so that's one of the big things about it is that because I know how the trigger works, I've shot thousands upon thousands of rounds through many Glocks, and I'm just used to it. But I'll tell you guys, this is a vast improvement. Now with the Glock trigger, you do have just a flat surface here at the top, and then it just cuts back at an angle. And so this is just a little bit of more of a flat face type pullback. One of the beautiful things about the flat face is that when you pull it back, you kind of pull it straight back, but it is at an angle. But this is definitely an improvement over just the curved trigger, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. Also, you have your safety right here, your trigger safety, and you can see back here at the back, when you depress it, it just makes this disappear to where you can fire the trigger. And the one good thing is you've got to have your finger right on the trigger safety for this to fire. And that's just one of the safe action qualities of the Glock trigger. Now, as far as the action of the trigger, we have some take up right here or pre-travel. And honestly, it's shortened. We just have a little bit right here. It hits a definite wall, a little bit of resistance, and then a nice crisp break. And that is definitely different than your standard Glock trigger. Reset right there. Pretty quick reset as well. And we're back on it. Now, one thing you'll notice is even after I've fired the pistol, the trigger goes forward, which is not typical for your Glock trigger. Usually when you fire the pistol for the last round, the trigger will be here toward the back. And we'll look at that with the standard Glock trigger. But overall, really nice short take up, much improved trigger break. No, it's not a competitive trigger break or a competition trigger. But definitely for a service trigger or a self-defense trigger, this is really a vast improvement. Now here with your standard Glock trigger, it just has a curve. There's no flat surface, it's just one radius right here. Again, you do have your trigger safety right here that works the same as the other one. So here as we pull the trigger, we have some take up right to here. It's a little bit longer than the enhanced trigger. We hit a definite wall, we have some resistance, and then we have a break. Now the Gen 5 breaks better than the 4 or 3 break, but definitely mushy, spongy feeling. And that's one thing you're not getting with the advanced trigger or enhanced trigger. As we reset, right there. Reset's not bad. In fact, the new enhanced trigger may have just a touch longer reset. But again, we had that little bit of a spongy feel to it. And you can see that the trigger stays in the rear position after the striker's been disengaged. Now here both strikers have been pulled, so you can see that we do have it pulling toward the back, and then here it's just in normal position. One thing about it with the trigger in the back position, you know that the trigger is not cocked. And so that is kind of a little bit of a plus for the original trigger. This one kind of pops back out. But so does it with most handguns. Here's also a comparison with that curve compared to the more flat style of the new enhanced trigger. And then again, we have that angle. So you're going to get a little more straight pullback against that flat surface. Here are the triggers when they are cocked. And so you can see that this trigger comes out on the original, but on the enhanced trigger, it's in the same position. Check the trigger pull weight with our Lyman trigger gauge from Brownells. 4 pounds, 0.3 ounces. 4 pounds, 1.9 ounces, and that's about where I'm getting, around the 4 pound range. And your Glock Gen 5 trigger, 5 pounds, 10 ounces. 5 pounds, 7.5 ounces. And that's what Glock says, about the 5.5 pound range. So right out of the box, you're getting a 4 pound trigger compared to a 5.5 pound trigger. I have seen reports of people getting even less. And two, these are fairly new triggers. I put about 500 rounds through this gun with this new enhanced trigger, and you know, over time it's going to really smooth out. And we want to thank Fiocchi for sponsoring our ammo. And guys, this stuff, we shoot a lot of it, and it really performs well. We don't have any reliability issues with the ammo. Also, they are made in the USA and #1 supplier of ammunition in the country. And of course, our Lula loaders, the Maglula is the bomb.com. It makes life so much easier. Fast. You know, when the Glock enhanced trigger came out, it surprised me in a sense, but yet You know, there's so many aftermarket Glock triggers out there, and people are changing them out. And so Glock coming out with their own kind of gives this a lot of credibility because it is a factory trigger. So, you know, and there are some triggers out there that are great at times, and they can, you know, hit or miss. But having an actual Glock trigger in this makes it just makes it kind of comforting, especially if you're using this for a self-defense option. It is a big difference. The trigger pull itself, it's a much cleaner break. The reset is faster. I mean, it is noticeable, the difference. And we were shooting this next to the Glock 47 with the standard Gen 5 trigger, and it is a big difference. It shoots really fast, but you know, easy to install. It's just really, I'm just really excited that Glock actually introduced it, plus the price is right. I mean, that reset, audible, it's tactile, and yet it just really comes back quick. Smooth break. It's not a competitive trigger break like a lot of the competitive triggers, but it's really a big and fast improvement over the standard Glock trigger. But one of the biggest things about this pistol is that it can shoot very fast. I mean, it can shoot faster than that, but that is really quick. And that trigger reset comes right back. The trigger pull is smooth, and you really just stay right there on target. So big fan, and just really excited that Glock is doing some things that are a little bit outside of the norm. We're going to disassemble the Model 17 with the enhanced trigger, and there's a little bit of a difference I've noticed. First thing we're going to do is make sure the gun is unloaded, and then you pull the trigger, pull back on the slide about 1/8 of an inch, and then pull down on your takedown tabs. And then you release the slide. It's a little bit of resistance coming over, but it does. With the standard Glock, it comes right out. Here we have the new enhanced trigger, and then here we have the traditional Gen 5 trigger. You'll notice that the trigger bar has this crucible type shape to it, and this has been pretty much what Glock has used from the beginning. Here with the new enhanced trigger, you see that there's just a single bar right here. And there are some differences that make this more of a single stage trigger and this more of like a stage and a half. I mean, it's a little bit different. One of the things you'll notice is that when you pull the trigger on the enhanced trigger, it just forces the crucible in the rear position. And this drops down this right here. And this is where your sear is. And so your sear actually drops down. In fact, if you pull this apart, this is free playing. It'll move around. And so this is what holds your striker assembly right here. Here with the original, it brings it forward. And so you're loosening this, and that's what releases the sear. And it's right on the back of that crucible. So it's a totally different feel to it. Right here on the original, the striker actually fits right here. And so when you pull the trigger, it drops down and allows the striker to fire. With the new enhanced trigger, it actually rides right back here at the back of this bar. And so when you pull the trigger, it drops it down and allows for the striker to go forward. And that's really the biggest deal, is there's a lot less play right here when you're bringing this down to drop that sear and to allow the firing pin to go. Now here we have the standard Gen 5 trigger here on the bottom and the enhanced trigger at the top. And you can see that the trigger bar itself has some differences and different configurations to it. And then here, another top view of it, and this of course is without the frame. But there are definitely some differences between these. Now one of the things that you do not want to do is to take the trigger bar off of the trigger housing. Because when you do, this little arm that goes in here, it is a little trick to get back together. In fact, I took this apart and had a heck of a time. In fact, Robbie Wheaton, thank goodness he was here, and even he, who has been a gunsmith for over 20 years, had to figure out how to get that back up under. And so I think it's Johnny Glock has a video on how to put that back, and he will say the same thing. Do not take this trigger bar off, or it's going to be, you know, a lot of trouble getting back on. So, and in fact, Glock recommends that as well. If we could get in here, this is actually free floating. This little area right here, it'll flop around. And if you pull off the trigger bar, this will actually move back and forth, which is something completely different. This is very similar to the Timney Glock trigger. And that is one of the things that, you know, that John even said, is that this kind of mimics a lot of the same features. The only thing about it with the Timney trigger is there have been some like primer strikes and some other things, and there are some differences. And I like Timney triggers, and I haven't had any experience, so I'm not going to bash those triggers because I think Timney does a good job. But I think with the OEM trigger that Glock has produced here and the R&D that's gone behind it, I think, you know, this is going to be an excellent trigger for self-defense, but yet it's going to improve it. But here you can see with the new enhanced trigger, it has a cutout here with this spring, and then here with the original, there's no cutout. And a little closer look at the rear of the trigger bar where it hits the connector. Here on the new enhanced version, we have a hole right here, and it's just a little bit of a different configuration. Now here you'll notice that there is a pin, and this is actually your ejector. You'll notice how that's curved, and that's curved for a reason to capture your 9mm shells. If you go with 40 caliber, it's going to be straight. And so that is one of the differences between a 9mm trigger and a 40 caliber trigger. And then the silver bar right here in the housing is actually a pin that holds this piece into place. If you pull off your ejector, you'll notice that this pin is a half pin that rests from here to right here. And again, this is something you do not want to get involved with unless you really know what you're doing, and I'm sure the Glock Armorer School would probably help you with that. Now you'll notice that as we pull the trigger bar back, it actually pushes this piece down. And so this again is what holds your striker or your firing pin into place. It rests right here, and then when this dips down, it comes over it. And then you have this surface that's really smooth where it doesn't engage the striker as it goes forward. Here with the original, as you bring it back, I mean, it just pushes it, it just drops down, and then it comes back. One thing too is it captures under this little area, and this is what keeps it safe. So it captures your trigger bar. Here again with the new trigger, it actually captures it as well. And this is part of the safety of your Glock. Let's look at pros and cons. The enhanced Glock trigger runs $99, and that's the manufacturer suggested retail price on Glock. If you compare that to a lot of other triggers, you're getting, you know, $250, $300. And some of them are hit or miss. I've had some really nice triggers that I thought that had really great trigger pulls, and then they had issues. So one great thing about this trigger in particular is you're going to have that Glock name standing behind this trigger. It is an OEM part, and you can really bet your life on them. Take-up's better, the brake is better, the reset is actually about the same or maybe even a little more with the new enhanced trigger, but it shoots really fast. That's one of the other things about the trigger pull, because it's so much more consistent and it doesn't have that spongy feel to it, and you really feel the brake, you feel it's tactile, and the reset's nice, and so it just gives you a really solid trigger pull. And the trigger weight is down to about 4 pounds compared to 4.5 pounds. Guys, the first time I tried this trigger, I could tell the vast improvement. For 99 bucks, you know, it's just really easy. It's easy to install, no problems. And just make sure again that you don't pull the trigger bar off the trigger housing. You can get it back together, but you know, it's kind of tough. A little bit tricky, but overall, great trigger option. So guys, a definite improvement over the original Glock trigger. In fact, it's a very acceptable trigger. No, it doesn't have that really crisp wall and that break that it has on some of these competitive triggers. But it's coming in at half or less the price. And again, it is OEM, so it's factory, and gives you really good reliability, plus gives you better liability in a self-defense situation. And we want to give a big thanks to Glock for providing the enhanced Glock trigger for this review. Be strong, be of good courage. God bless America. Long live the Republic. trigger pull weight also is excellent, which I have forgotten about. It's really for Gen 5, so we're really, okay, from the Glock guy. So, you know, there's some deal, okay. And then the slide will go forward. You have to, I had to hit that just